He sees that there is no husband beside her, holding her hand, grieving with her. He sees no sons or daughters by her side, holding her up. He only sees the woman and her dead son, and a crowd who knows that they are not only attending to the funeral of this young man, but also the end of life for this poor widow. Rachel Adler, who is an author and theologian, knows this. She says the Hebrew word for widow literally means to be unable to speak. Adler says the man who spoke for the widow is gone, and in his absence, the woman has been silenced. Jesus notices this silenced woman, attends to her, and indeed transforms her from a woman who had no way to speak for herself into a woman who was spoken for by the Lord. It is, after all, through an act of speech, remember, young man, I say to you, arise, that Jesus restores her son. Moved by her grief and tragedy of her life, Jesus reaches out with unbidden grace, with the unasked for grace, and restores her life to the fullest measure possible. And as a result, what was once a funeral procession gets transformed into a street party, celebrating the life of one who was once dead and another who was once lost, and the whole city proclaimed the prophetic ministry of the messenger and the bringer of God's grace. Flipping back to the Gulf Coast, it is so easy to become totally overwhelmed by what we are witnessing in the Gulf of Mexico. Just as we can become overwhelmed by our own problems, our own personal death marches. So sometimes it can be very helpful to stop what we're doing and regroup, to gather ourselves up and remind ourselves of who we are and to whom we belong. Wendell Berry's poem, The Peace of Wild Things, points a way through the despair and instructs us in the way back to the grace of God. He writes, "When despair for the world grows in me, and I awake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty in the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the grace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars awaiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of this world and am free." When the unbidden grace of God comes smashing, crashing into our death-marching lives, nothing less than resurrection happens, and we are set free. Some of you are familiar with the author and Presbyterian activist Annie Lamott. Her book, Traveling Mercies, chronicles her journey from atheism, alcoholism, and addiction to drugs to a life of faith and belief in God's grace, and eventually becoming what she calls a self-proclaimed Jesus-loving liberal. Her life story is an example of how unbidden grace, through specific acts of compassion, can halt one human being's death march and turn it into a celebration of life. Lamott says that before she got sober, she used to walk by a little Presbyterian church in Marin County, California, and lean against the outside walls of the little clapboard church, high on drugs or alcohol, listening to the music and the message, and wishing she could find just a little bit of love and compassion that she sensed coming from inside. One day, a big African-American woman in a flowered dress and a hat the size of Texas came outside ushered little Annie into the church building. It didn't matter that she wasn't sober that day. It didn't matter that she wasn't all dressed up. What matters is that the church inside went outside and brought her in and taught her about the grace of God and the compassion that Jesus showed those that he met who were also on the margins of his society. They taught her about the stories like the widow of Zarephath and also the widow of Nain. And they told her about the teachings of Jesus and that we are all to go out and do the same for others. So, what say we go outside and take a look around and see who's leaning in on our walls, seeking a little grace? I think it sure beats watching the news. Let's take a moment for reflection.